"Please don't look at my back," the maid begged. But the prince did, and burst into tears. In the candlelit halls of a grand palace, a scarred servant girl hides beneath a shawl, praying no one ever sees what the fire left behind. But when a drunken noble pulls at her clothes, the prince himself steps forward, and the secret she's carried all her life is laid bare before the court. Instead of scorn, he breaks down weeping, shaking the kingdom to its very core. Now whispers spread like wildfire. Has the prince lost his mind, or uncovered a truth that could change everything? Scandal rises, loyalties shift, and the girl who wished only to be invisible finds herself at the very center of the storm. But what makes a man of royal blood shed tears over a servant's scars? And when love defies the crown, will compassion triumph, or will the cost of defiance tear them both apart? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The great hall of the royal palace blazed with warmth and light, a welcome refuge from the bitter winter night beyond its ancient stone walls. Hundreds of beeswax, candles sparkled in crystal chandeliers, their gentle glow reflecting off the polished marble floors. Noble ladies in silk gowns swept across the chamber, while gentlemen in powdered wigs gathered near roaring hearths, their jewelry glinting as they gestured with wine glasses in hand. Among the splendor, Eleanor moved like a shadow in her plain wool dress and white apron. Unlike the other servants who had shed their shawls in the hall's warmth, she kept hers pulled tight around her shoulders, her fingers clutching the worn fabric as if it were armor. She focused on her work, collecting empty glasses onto her tray with quiet efficiency, trying to remain unseen among the celebrating nobles. "Have you heard? Prince Adrian has returned from the northern campaign," a lady in purple silk whispered behind her fan. Her companion leaned closer, pearl drops swaying at her ears. "They say he's changed, the things he saw in battle." The rest was lost in a burst of laughter from nearby courtiers. The great doors swung open, and a hush fell over the assembly. Prince Adrian strode in, still wearing his military uniform rather than court dress. His dark blue coat bore the dust of the road, and his boots were unpolished, a striking contrast to the peacock finery around him. Yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity that drew all eyes. Ladies curtsied deeply as he passed, while gentlemen bowed and murmured, "Your Highness." Eleanor kept to the edges of the crowd, methodically gathering glasses. She had nearly filled her tray when a hand grabbed, roughly at her shawl. "What's this, then?" Lord Varane's wine-soaked breath washed over her as he tugged at the fabric. "So modest, little mouse? The hall is warm enough to make ladies fan themselves, yet you huddle in wool?" "Please, my lord," Eleanor whispered, trying to step back without spilling the glasses. "I prefer to keep it." "Prefer?" He laughed, yanking harder. "Since when do servants have preferences?" "Let's see what you're hiding. Please don't look at my back," Eleanor cried out, her voice cutting through the elegant murmur of conversation. But it was too late. The shawl slipped from her shoulders, revealing the twisted scars that marked her from neck to waist, visible through her thin dress. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lord Varane recoiled, his face twisting in disgust. "Good God, girl! Cover that horror!" Eleanor's hands trembled so violently that the glasses began to slide. But before they could fall, strong fingers steadied the tray. Prince Adrian himself stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the savage marks that told their own story of suffering. To everyone's astonishment, tears began rolling down the prince's cheeks. He made no attempt to hide them as he shrugged off his military coat and draped it gently around Eleanor's shoulders. "Your Highness," Lord Varane protested, "surely you don't mean to soil your uniform by—" Silence. Adrian's voice was soft, but carried such authority that Varane stumbled back. The prince turned to Eleanor, who stood frozen in shock, wrapped in his coat that smelled of horse and leather and the open road. "Come, You're safe now." He guided her toward a side door, one hand, protectively at her elbow. The crowd parted before them, noble faces marked with scandal and speculation. Whispers followed in their wake. "Did you see? The prince wept. A common servant. Those terrible scars. What can it mean?" But Adrian paid them no mind as he escorted Eleanor from the hall, leaving behind a stunned silence broken only by the crackling of fires in their marble hearths. The stone corridors echoed with their footsteps as Prince Adrian led Eleanor away from the great hall's warmth. Tapestries rustled in drafts that whistled through arrow-slit windows, and the few wall-mounted torches cast jumping shadows across weathered stone. His military coat hung heavy on her shoulders, still carrying the warmth of his body. They descended. Narrow servants' stairs, the rough walls close on either side, until they reached a small chamber lit by a single tallow candle. Its weak light barely reached the corners where dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with mint and rosemary. "Please, sit," Adrian said softly, gesturing to a wooden stool. His eyes were still red from tears, but his voice was steady. Eleanor perched uncertainly on the edge, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Your Highness, I should return to my duties. The housekeeper will—" "Let me speak first," he interrupted, though gently. He remained standing, running a hand through his unpowdered hair. "Those scars! I've seen their like before, too many times." Eleanor stiffened, but Adrian continued, his voice growing hoarse. "In the northern campaigns, I saw villages burned, soldiers and civilians alike, marked forever by flame. Each scar told a story of pain, yes, but also of survival, of courage." "There was no courage in mine, Your Highness," Eleanor whispered, staring at the rough-hewn floor. "Only desperation. Tell me," he urged, crouching down to meet her downcast eyes. "Please." She drew a shaky breath. "I was 12. The fire started in the kitchen thatch. So fast, so hungry. My brother Thomas was only 4. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of his coat. "He was trapped in the back room. I couldn't leave him." "You went back for him?" Adrian said softly. Eleanor nodded. "The ceiling was falling. I covered him with my body until help came. That's all." She straightened her shoulders. "I don't tell this story to earn pity, Your Highness. I wish only to work in peace, to earn my bread honestly. These scars need not concern anyone. They concerned Lord Verrain enough to shame you publicly." Adrian's voice hardened. "Such cruelty will not stand. You have my word. None shall ridicule. You again. Your Highness is kind, but not kind. Just." He stood, passion filling his voice. "I've seen too much suffering ignored by those in power. I won't add to it by staying silent." Meanwhile, through the palace's elaborate network of corridors and chambers, whispers raced like wildfire. Servants murmured to ladies' maids, who whispered to their mistresses, who hurried to share the shocking tale. The prince weeping openly over a scarred servant girl. The gossip reached the king's private chamber, where he sat reviewing state papers by candlelight. His secretary, nervous but duty-bound, related the evening's events. Tears? The king's quill paused mid-stroke. "My son shed tears before the entire court?" "Over a maid's scars, Your Majesty. He gave her his own coat and led her away himself." The king's face darkened like a gathering storm. "These foreign campaigns have softened him. A prince cannot show such weakness." Back in the servants' chamber, Adrian reluctantly prepared to leave. "I'll have someone escort you to your quarters." "Thank you, Your Highness, but I know the way." Eleanor stood, carefully removing his coat. She folded it with precise movements, the fabric still warm from her body. He accepted it with a bow that made her flush. "Rest well, Eleanor." Under the watchful eyes of other servants, some curious, some envious, some suspicious, Eleanor made her way to the female servants' dormitory. The long room was cold, moonlight streaming through high windows, onto rows of narrow beds. She found her straw mattress, still made with military precision from that morning, but sleep wouldn't come. Eleanor lay rigid beneath her thin blanket, mind racing with the evening's events. The prince's tears, his gentle words, his promised protection, all felt like a dream. But dreams could turn to nightmares. She shivered, wondering what this scandal would cost her. The peaceful obscurity she'd built so carefully had shattered like fine crystal on marble floors. Now, she could only wait to see what morning would bring. The morning bell's deep toll echoed through the castle's stone corridors as servants rushed to begin their daily tasks. Golden sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. In the busy hallways, maids hefted wooden buckets of water while others dropped to their knees, scrubbing the wooden floors until they gleamed. Eleanor kept her head down as she worked, all too aware of the whispers that followed her like shadows. Her fingers trembled slightly as she polished a brass candlestick, trying to ignore the sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped whenever she drew near. "Did you hear about last night?" one maid whispered to another. "The prince himself. Hush now," came the reply, though both servants cast curious looks in Eleanor's direction. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, filled with the warmth of ovens and the sharp commands of the cook. Eleanor had just finished arranging fresh herbs when familiar bootsteps made her heart skip. Prince Adrian appeared in the doorway, his presence causing an immediate ripple of bows and curtsies. "Good morrow," he said, his voice carrying an unusual gentleness. In his hands, he held a loaf of fresh bread. "I've come to inspect the morning's provisions." The kitchen staff exchanged knowing looks. Never before had the prince concerned himself with such mundane matters. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as Adrian approached her work table. "The herbs look well tended," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "Tell me, are you feeling better after last evening's unfortunate incident?" "Yes, Your Highness," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are most kind to inquire." Their exchange was brief, proper on the surface, but the tenderness in Adrian's gaze spoke volumes. Around them, servants pretended to focus on their tasks while straining to hear every word. The peaceful moment shattered as heavy footsteps approached. The king's commanding presence filled the doorway, his face dark with displeasure. "Adrian!" he barked. "A word! Now!" Father and son withdrew to a private chamber, where their voices soon rose in heated discussion. Through the thick oak door, servants could hear fragments of their argument. "This infatuation must end," the king declared, his tone brooking no argument. "You are a prince, not some love-struck shepherd boy." "She is a person of worth," Adrian responded, his voice steady despite his father's anger. "I will not dismiss her like yesterday's weather. You forget yourself and your position." "No, father. I remember exactly who I am and what that means." Throughout the morning, whispers spread through the castle like wildfire. In the grand halls, ladies behind painted fans spoke of enchantments and witches' spells. In the courtyard, lords muttered about the shame of it all. "The maid must be dismissed," Lady Rothford declared to her circle. "Such creatures bring nothing but trouble." "Indeed," agreed Lord Pembroke. "A prince weeping over a servant? Most unnatural." Eleanor tried to make herself invisible as she went about her duties, but she could feel the weight of suspicious stares following her every move. Her hands shook as she folded linens, her mind racing with fears of losing her position, her only means of supporting her brother. As afternoon light slanted through the windows, a herald's voice rang out through the castle halls. His Royal Highness Prince Adrian is commanded to attend His Majesty the King at supper this evening without fail." Eleanor, who had been carrying fresh towels past the herald, felt her blood turn to ice. The formal summons, delivered with such gravity, could mean nothing good. She clutched the linens tighter to her chest, feeling as though the walls of the castle were closing in around her. In the servants' corridor, she paused to catch her breath, the dread settling deep in her bones. The towels in her arms couldn't hide her trembling as she wondered what fate awaited not just her, but the kind-hearted prince who had dared to show her compassion. The royal supper hall glowed with amber light from 100 torches mounted along stone walls. Their flames cast dancing shadows across the carved wooden table where Prince Adrian sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped tightly in his lap. At the head of the table, the king's face was thunderous, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. Eleanor moved quietly among the other servants, distributing fresh-baked bread from her basket. Though she kept her eyes downcast, every harsh word from the king pierced her heart like needles. "You shame yourself in this crown," the king declared, cutting into his roasted pheasant with sharp movements. "A prince does not weep over servant. Girls, what will our allies think? What of the Princess of Normandy whose hand we sought for you?" The clatter of Adrian's fork against his plate echoed through the hall. "I saw no shame, father, only courage beyond measure." His voice grew stronger. "She bears those scars because she saved her brother's life. While others fled the flames, she shielded him with her own body. Tell me, is that not the very nobility of spirit we claim to value?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she placed a warm roll beside a nobleman's plate. Heat crept up her neck as heads turned, whispers following her movements. "Nobility of spirit does not forge alliances or secure kingdoms," the king snapped. "Your behavior threatens years of careful diplomacy. Already the Normandy court sends concerned messages about your emotional display." "Then let them be concerned," Adrian replied, his shoulders straight despite his father's glare. "I would rather show honest feeling than hide behind cold propriety. While cruelty passes unchallenged," the king's fist struck the table, making the crystal goblets jump. "Enough! You will remember your position, or I shall be forced to take measures to protect this family's dignity." Eleanor hurried from the hall, her empty basket clutched to her chest, fighting back tears. In the servants' corridor, she nearly collided with Clara, who pulled her into an alcove lit by a single guttering candle. "Eleanor, listen." Clara's eyes shone with excitement. "I found something while organizing the old records in the archive today. Your mother's name was in a betrothal document from 20 years ago." "What?" Eleanor whispered, her heart skipping. "She was promised to Lord Edmund of Westbrook before she married your father instead. It was properly signed and sealed. You have noble blood, even if it's just a drop." Clara squeezed her friend's hands. "You're not just a servant after all." Before Eleanor could respond, footsteps approached. Prince Adrian appeared in the corridor, his face lighting up at the sight of them. "Your Highness?" Both women curtsied deeply. "Please rise," he said softly. "I heard what you said about the betrothal document. This changes everything. With proof of noble lineage, however distant, even my father must acknowledge your worth." Eleanor shook her head, her voice trembling. "My lord, please. Such claims will only bring more mockery. I am content with my place. I ask only to serve in peace." "But don't you see?" Adrian stepped closer, his eyes bright with hope. "This is Providence itself. I shall present this evidence to my father tomorrow. He cannot dismiss it without appearing to scorn the very principles of noble blood he holds so dear." Later that night, in her tiny chamber beneath the eaves, Eleanor knelt beside her narrow bed. The single candle on her windowsill cast just enough light to see her clasped hands as she prayed. "Lord above," she whispered, Grant me strength to face whatever comes. Let no harm befall those who show me kindness, and if it be thy will." She paused, a tear sliding down her cheek. "Protect his gentle heart from breaking over one as humble as I." Frost-rimed carriages creaked to a halt before the palace gates, their wheels crunching through fresh snow. The winter gathering was in full swing as nobles swept up the torch-lit steps, their jewels glinting like captured stars. Inside, hundreds of beeswax candles cast a golden glow across the great hall, making the silk gowns shimmer and the crystal goblets sparkle. Eleanor stood among the servants, her patched wool dress, a stark contrast to the fine garments surrounding her. Though she had mended it carefully, the worn fabric drew disapproving glances from passing ladies. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the silver tray in her hands. "You there, girl," called Lady Ashworth, her voice dripping with disdain. "Bring more wine." She turned to her companion, whispering loud enough to be heard. "Can you imagine? That scarred creature still allowed to serve at court?" Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she stepped forward steadily. Before she could reach them, Prince Adrien appeared at her side. His presence sent a ripple through the crowd. "My dear Eleanor," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the hall, "would you honor me with this dance?" The music faltered. Goblets froze halfway to lips. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest as she stared at his outstretched hand. "Your Highness," she whispered, "I cannot. I do not know the steps." "Then I shall teach you," he smiled, taking the tray from her trembling fingers and passing it to another servant. "Trust me." As he led her to the center of the hall, scandalized murmurs erupted like angry wasps. The Duchess of Marlowe pressed a handkerchief to her mouth in horror. Young Lord Pembroke dropped his quizzing glass. "Keep your eyes on me," Adrian murmured, positioning her hands correctly. "Nothing else matters." The musicians, after a pointed "Look from the prince," struck up a gentle minuet. Eleanor's feet felt clumsy at first, but Adrian guided her with careful patience. The candlelight caught the silver threads in his uniform, and his eyes held such tenderness that she almost forgot their audience. "You are doing beautifully," he whispered as they turned. "See how naturally you move? Your grace puts these courtiers to shame." Some faces in the crowd had softened. Lady Winchester dabbed at her eyes, while several younger nobles watched with poorly concealed romance in their expressions. Others maintained their shock. Lord Varane's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "They will never accept me," Eleanor breathed, though her heart felt lighter than it had in years. "They need not accept you," Adrian replied, leading her through another turn. "I accept you. I see your courage, your kindness, your strength. What? Are there shallow judgments against such qualities?" As they danced, Eleanor felt something long buried stirring in her chest. Joy, pure and simple, rising like dawn after endless night. For the first time since the fire, she felt truly seen, not for her scars, but for herself. The music drew to a close. Adrian bowed deeply, then raised her hand to his lips. The kiss was gentle, reverent, and utterly scandalous. Eleanor's fingers tingled where his lips had touched. "Thank you for the dance, my lady," he said formally, though his eyes sparkled with affection. Just then, movement at the hall's entrance caught Eleanor's attention. A messenger in travel-stained clothes hurried in, his expression grim. The joy that had bloomed in her chest withered slightly as she watched him approach one of the royal stewards, speaking in urgent whispers. But even the messenger's ominous presence couldn't entirely dim the warmth of this moment. For the first time in years, Eleanor had danced. For the first time since the fire that marked her, she had felt beautiful. and in Prince Adrian's eyes, she saw a future she had never dared to imagine. The messenger's boots echoed against the marble floor as he approached, interrupting the tender moment between Eleanor and Prince Adrian. His face was grim, reddened from the biting winter wind. He bowed low, holding out a crumpled letter sealed with common wax. "Message for Miss Eleanor, with grave urgency," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the letter, her heart pounding beneath her patched bodice. As she read the hastily scrawled words, all color drained from her face. "My brother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's fallen ill with fever in Millbrook Village. They say he may not survive the night." Adrian steadied her as she swayed on her feet. "When must you leave?" "Now, Your Highness. I must go now." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked toward the windows, where snow swirled in the darkness. "But the roads, in this weather." "Then we shall arrange transport immediately." Adrian's voice was firm as he turned to his steward. "Ready my finest carriage, with extra blankets and hot bricks for warmth." The king's stern voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "You forget yourself, my son. The prince cannot concern himself with a servant's family matters." But Adrian stood tall, his jaw set with determination. "I shall travel as a simple gentleman. Father, no royal fanfare, no ceremonies, just a concerned friend accompanying a lady in distress." Within the hour, Eleanor found herself wrapped in thick wool blankets inside the carriage, her few belongings hastily packed. Adrian had changed into plain gentleman's clothing, though the fine cut of his coat still marked him as wealthy. The carriage lurched forward into the snowy night, lanterns swaying as they illuminated the treacherous path ahead. For 2 days they traveled through the bitter cold. The carriage wheels struggled through frozen ruts, while icy branches cracked overhead. Eleanor barely slept, her thoughts fixed on her brother. Adrian kept her warm with extra blankets and stories of his campaigns, speaking of courage and hope rather than battle and glory. When they finally reached the humble cottage in Millbrook Village, Eleanor nearly fell in her haste to reach the door. Inside, her brother lay on a thin mattress, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. "He's been like this 3 days now," the neighbor woman tending him said, wringing her hands in her apron. "The physician came once, but when we couldn't, pay his fee." As if summoned by these words, the local physician appeared in the doorway, his fine coat a stark contrast to the cottage's simple furnishings. His cold eyes swept over Eleanor's worn dress with clear disdain. "I see you've returned," he said, his voice clipped. "Though unless you've brought payment this time, I'm afraid I can be of no assistance." Eleanor's heart sank as she counted the few coins in her purse. "Please, sir? He's all the family I have left." The physician turned away. "I don't work on credit, girl, especially not for common folk." "How much?" Adrian's quiet voice carried authority, even without his royal trappings. The physician named a sum that made Eleanor gasp. It was more than she earned in 6 months. But Adrian simply reached into his coat and produced a purse heavy with gold coins. "This should cover his care and medicines," he said, pressing the purse into the physician's suddenly eager hands. "I trust you will attend him properly now." As the physician hurried to examine her brother, Eleanor turned to Adrian, tears streaming down her scarred face. "Your Highness, I can never repay—" Adrian took her hand in his touch gentle but firm. "You owe me nothing, dear heart. I promise you this. Whatever comes, whatever my father's wrath may bring, I will not abandon you or your brother. You are no longer alone." In the dim candlelight of the cottage, with her brother's fate still uncertain and the weight of royal disapproval looming, Eleanor felt the truth of his words warm her more than any fire could. The winter wind howled through the castle corridors. as Adrian and Eleanor returned from their journey. Dark circles marked their eyes, their clothes still dusted with snow from the road. They had rushed back to court after leaving Eleanor's brother in the care of a kind village woman who promised to nurse him through his fever. Adrian strode purposefully through the castle, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floors. "The royal physician will know what to do," he assured Eleanor, though worry lined his face. "He has studied with the finest doctors in Europe." But when they found the physician in his chambers, surrounded by leather-bound medical texts and bottles of expensive tinctures, his response chilled them more than the winter air. "The crown's healers do not waste time on peasants," he declared, barely looking up from his gilt-edged manuscript. "I serve the nobility, Your Highness, not common folk, who cannot pay." Adrian's hands clenched into fists. "This is my direct request as your prince." The physician merely sniffed. "Even you, sir, cannot command me to lower my station so. I answer only to His Majesty the King." Word of their return, and the physician's refusal, spread quickly through the castle. Within hours, Adrian stood before his father in the private royal chamber, where a great fire roared yet gave no warmth to their exchange. "You disgrace yourself," the king thundered, his scarred face twisted with anger. "First you weep publicly over a servant, then you dance with her before the entire court. Now you demand royal physicians attend her family. Father, I beg you to show mercy," Adrian pleaded. "Her brother may die without proper care. Would you have me stand idle while—" "Enough!" The king slammed his hand on the oak table between them. "I have been patient with your peculiarities since returning from war, but this ends now." His voice dropped dangerously low. "You will renounce this maid, or you will forfeit your right of succession to the crown." The words echoed in the chamber like a death knell. Adrian stood silent, pale but straight-backed. Through the castle's efficient network of whispers, word of the king's ultimatum reached Eleanor within the hour. She sat alone in the servants' quarters, tears falling silently as she packed her few belongings into a small cloth bundle. Her hands shook as she folded her worn shawl, the same one that had slipped that fateful night at the ball. "I cannot be the reason he loses everything," she whispered to herself. "Better to leave quietly, to spare him this choice." The stable yards lay silent under fresh-fallen snow as Eleanor crept out in the gathering dusk. She had nearly reached the stable doors when a familiar voice called out behind her. "You would leave without saying goodbye?" Eleanor turned to find Adrian standing there, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. Her heart clenched at the sight of him. "Your Highness, please," she began, but he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Do not call me that," he said softly. "Not you." Snow swirled around them in the growing darkness as he took her hands in his. "I know what you're trying to do, but I cannot let you sacrifice yourself for my crown." "But your father—" "My father would have me choose between power and compassion." Adrian's voice was firm despite the emotion in his eyes. "I would rather live as a man in exile, true to my heart, than rule as a prince who abandoned his conscience." Eleanor stared up at him, reading the determination in his face. Before she could respond, the castle bell began to toll, its deep sound rolling across the snowy courtyard. A page boy came running through the stable yard. "His Majesty commands all to gather in the great hall at dawn," he announced breathlessly. "The entire court is summoned to witness his judgment." Adrian's grip tightened on Eleanor's hands as the page disappeared back into the castle. Tomorrow would bring their final confrontation with the king before all the nobles of the realm. The snow continued to fall around them in the deepening night, as if nature herself held her breath for what dawn would bring. The great hall stretched vast and cold despite the roaring hearths. Morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The king sat rigid upon his golden throne, his face like carved stone as he surveyed the assembled court. Dozens of nobles lined the walls in there, finest winter silks and furs, their whispers rushing through the air like dry leaves in wind. Before the throne, Prince Adrian stood tall in his military dress, though his shoulders carried a weight heavier than any battlefield burden. Beside him, Eleanor trembled in her simple wool dress, her hands clasped tightly before her. The contrast between them could not have been starker. He in royal blue and gold braid, she in dull brown homespun. "You have been summoned," the king's voice rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. "To witness judgment. My son, Prince Adrian, heir to this realm, stands accused of conduct unbecoming his station." Eleanor felt her heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird. She kept, her eyes lowered, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares upon her scarred back. Even through her shawl, their judgment burned. "Father," Adrian's voice rang clear and steady, "before you pass judgment, know that I act not from rebellion, but from conscience." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Adrian reached up and removed the golden coronet from his brow, its jewels catching the morning light. The sound of his boot heels echoed as he approached the throne's steps. "If rule requires us to turn our backs on compassion," he declared, each word measured and clear, "then I am unfit to rule." The coronet clinked softly as he laid it at his father's feet. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of flames in the hearths. "You would throw away your birthright?" The king's voice had grown dangerously quiet. "For a maid, for the right to love with an open heart," Adrian replied. "For the courage to see worth beyond birth and station. For the freedom to honor the scars of sacrifice." He turned slightly, his gaze finding Eleanor. Her scars were earned protecting her brother from fire. What better proof of noble spirit could there be? Gasps echoed through the hall. Ladies behind their fans whispered frantically to one another. Several older lords shook their heads in dismay, but others watched with different eyes now, seeing perhaps for the first time the quiet dignity in Eleanor's stance, the strength beneath her modesty. "You would lay down crown and title?" The king's fingers gripped his throne's armrests until his knuckles showed white. "You would choose exile? I would choose to live as a man of honor rather than rule as a prince without compassion." Adrian's voice carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "If that means exile, then so be it." The coronet gleamed at the king's feet, its golden circlet, reflecting the morning light like a fallen star. Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes, knowing the magnitude of Adrian's sacrifice. She could not let him throw away everything for her sake. With trembling fingers, she reached for his hand. Their fingers twined together, warm against the chill air of the great hall. In that touch was everything they stood to lose. And everything they had found in each other. The king rose slowly from his throne, his face ashen. The movement seemed to cost him great effort, as though unseen weights dragged at his limbs. His eyes fixed on their joined hands with an expression Eleanor had never seen before. Not anger, but something far more complex. For a long moment he stood silent, the entire court holding its breath. The fate of prince and maid, of love and duty, hung suspended in that frozen instant between heartbeats. The great hall fell utterly silent as the king descended the throne steps with measured grace. His boots clicked against the marble, each step echoing through the cavernous space. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the silver threads in his dark hair, making them shimmer like fresh snow. He paused before Adrian and Eleanor, his stern facade cracking ever so slightly. Something stirred in his eyes, a long-buried memory fighting its way to the surface. "You speak of scars," he said, his voice softer than before. of dignity and suffering. His fingers moved to the elaborate fasteners of his royal jacket, shocking the assembled court as he began to undo them. "Your Majesty," the royal physician stepped forward, alarmed. "Surely you need not—" "Silence," the king commanded, though without his usual harshness. The physician retreated, bowing deeply. The king shed his outer jacket, then rolled up the sleeve of his fine linen shirt. There, twisting up his forearm like gnarled vines, were deep scars that had long since turned silver with age. A collective gasp rose from the courtiers. "These I earned at the Battle of Ardennes, 30 years past," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "Protecting my own brother from cavalry charge. He did not survive, but these marks remained. My shame, my reminder." Eleanor's eyes widened as she stared at the king's scars, so like her own. Beside her, Adrian drew in a sharp breath. "I buried them beneath silk and ceremony," the king continued, "hid weakness behind power. When I saw you weep for this maiden's scars, my son, it awakened something I had long forgotten. That compassion is not weakness, but the highest strength." He turned to address the court, his voice growing stronger. "We have been blind. These marks are not disgrace. They are testament to courage, to sacrifice, to love itself." The king's gaze swept the assembly, challenging any who would disagree. None dared meet his eye. Then he turned to the royal physician, who stood rigid. With apprehension, "You will attend to Eleanor's brother immediately," he commanded. "Spare no expense or effort in his care, and henceforth your services shall be available to all who need them, regardless of station. A crown that cannot protect its people is no crown at all." "Yes, your Majesty." The physician bowed deeply, chastened. The king faced Adrian and Eleanor once more. His features had softened, years of rigid protocol melting away like spring thaw. "My son," he said, reaching down to lift the coronet from where it lay. "Your compassion does not make you unfit to rule. It makes you more worthy than I have ever been." He placed the coronet back upon Adrian's brow with gentle hands. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he took Eleanor's trembling hand and placed it in his son's. "Your scars, child," he said softly to her, "are your nobility. They speak of a heart brave enough to sacrifice all for love of family. What better quality could I wish for in a daughter?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as the king stepped back, raising his voice to address the court once more. "Let it be known throughout the realm. On this day I give my blessing and approval to the betrothal of my son, Prince Adrian, to the Lady Eleanor, whose nobility of spirit outshines any accident of birth." One by one, the assembled nobles sank to their knees. Even those who had whispered cruel gossip now bowed their heads, moved by the king's transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows, bathing the scene in golden light as if heaven itself blessed this union. The royal physician knelt closest to the throne, his former arrogance replaced by genuine humility. Lords and ladies who had sneered at Eleanor's patched wool dress now pressed hands to hearts in respect. Throughout the great hall, not a single voice dared break the profound silence of this moment. In that hush, surrounded by kneeling courtiers, Adrian and Eleanor stood hand in hand before the king. Their fingers remained intertwined, no longer in defiance but in triumph, their love having awakened compassion in a heart long frozen by protocol and power. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the royal chapel, painting ribbons of gold and crimson across the stone floor. The morning air carried the sweet perfume of early spring blossoms, mixed with the familiar scent of beeswax candles that lined the ancient walls. After 3 proper readings of the banns on consecutive Sundays, as tradition demanded, the day had finally arrived for Prince Adrian to wed his beloved Eleanor. The chapel buzzed with quiet whispers as nobles filled the front pews, their silk, gowns rustling. But it was the back of the chapel that truly glowed with joy. There sat the castle's servants, cooks and maids, their worn hands clasped together in pride and wonder. Among them, Eleanor's brother Thomas sat tall and strong, his recent brush with fever forgotten as his eyes shone with tears of joy. "Never thought I'd see the day," whispered one kitchen maid to another, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "One of our own, becoming a princess. The music swelled from the organ pipes, and all heads turned as Eleanor appeared in the doorway. Her gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk, modest yet elegant, with high lace at the neck and long sleeves that sparkled with tiny pearls. The back was carefully crafted, not to hide her scars as she had once done, but to acknowledge them with dignity. Delicate embroidery traced paths that mirrored the marks beneath, transforming them into a pattern of beauty that told her story of sacrifice and love. At the altar, Prince Adrian's breath caught in his throat. Tears welled in his eyes, not of pity or shame, but of pure joy and pride. The king, standing beside his son, placed a gentle hand on Adrian's shoulder. The old monarch's own eyes glistened as he watched the bride approach, remembering his own hidden scars and the lessons of humanity he had learned. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice carrying to every corner of the sacred space, "we are gathered here in the sight of God." Clara, Eleanor's friend from the servants' quarters, could barely contain her sobs of happiness. Other maids held her hands tightly, sharing in her joy. They had watched Eleanor suffer under cruel whispers for so long, and now they witnessed her triumph of love over prejudice. When the time came for vows, Adrian spoke first, his voice clear and strong. "I, Adrian, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife. I vow to honor your courage, cherish your strength, and love you completely. Marks, memories, and all that makes you who you are." Eleanor's voice trembled but grew steadier with each word. "I, Eleanor, take thee, Adrian, to be my wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you with the same courage that brought us here, to love you with the same strength that saved my brother, and to trust in the grace that brought us together." The exchange of rings drew fresh tears from the assembled crowd. Thomas beamed from his place of honor, remembering how his sister had shielded him from the flames so many years ago. Now she stood transformed, not despite her scars, but because of the strength they represented. As the ceremony drew to a close, the priest pronounced them man and wife. The chapel erupted in cheers that transcended all class boundaries, nobles and servants alike celebrating love's victory over society's constraints. Later that night, in their new chamber warmed by a crackling fire, Adrian and Eleanor finally found themselves alone. The silk of her wedding gown whispered as she stood before him, no longer afraid. With gentle fingers, Adrian traced the scars upon her back, each touch a blessing, each caress a promise. "These are not your burden," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They are the crown I choose." Eleanor leaned back into his embrace, feeling truly at peace for the first time since that long-ago fire. The flames in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls as she finally allowed herself to rest, wholly loved and completely accepted. In Adrian's arms, she had found not just a prince, but a love that transformed all her perceived flaws into marks of honor. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.